So now let's get into the economic news coming out of the United States. And this is juicy.
This is sexy.
This is good. This is really good news, guys.
Yeah.
We have annual inflation over the second half of 2023 officially fell back to the Federal Reserve's 2% target.
Yeah.
Now, what do I mean by that? Because all of you, if you watch the show, you're like, wait a second, Anthony, I thought 2 weeks ago you told me that inflation numbers were still at 3 point something percent or something like that. Well, if we only take the last 6 months and then multiply that number by 2, and we annualize the last 6 months of 2023, we get our 2% number. So if the trends of the last half of 2023 continue, we will be back in the Federal Reserve 2% target, which is just awesome news that we've been able to stick this landing, guys.
Yes.
And that we have to put that in perspective of how truly amazing this is. We were in an inflationary spike up to 8%. We had two quarters of economic growth that were negative, and then we were back with massive economic growth of 3.1% over the last 12 months.
Crazy.
The best in the world. The best in the world.
Well, the best out of our comparative
Yeah,
countries.
the best out of our comparative countries. Obviously, smaller developing countries will have way higher rates of growth, but that's not the point. Point is, our peered countries were vastly overperforming them.
Yeah.
And economists need to go back to the drawing board and wrestle with some things. We have operated under the assumption for like 4 decades now that unemployment and inflation have an inverse relationship where the higher unemployment is, the lower inflation is, and the lower unemployment is, the higher inflation is. Well, we have a long and this is called the Phillips curve, okay? Now we have a long, 2 decades of data that have totally broken that trend. From 1995 to 2013, there was absolutely no corollary effect, no correlation between cyclical unemployment and inflation. That was not the case. In the 1980s, in the 1970s, in the 60s, there was a direct relationship. Not anymore. And that tells us a lot about our maybe mastering of monetary policy. Maybe it tells us a little something that made that time period had more confounding effects that we didn't recognize at the time.
Yeah,
Some economist is going to win the Nobel Prize by proving why the Phillips curve was never a thing.
Yes, but I also want to point out that this should just ratchet up our skepticism of economists.
Yes.
Some economists will win the Nobel Prize for saying the Phillips curve isn't right, and then whatever framework they come up with will probably be proven wrong in 25 more years. Okay?
Yes.
So you're going to read tons of New York Times articles, tons of articles from all over the internet, tons of publications that will cite these well-reputed, highly paid economists that make these predictions about the economy, just like last year, where the vast majority of economists were sure that we were going to face a recession in 2023. And they're just going to be wrong.
Yeah.
So I don't want us to trust them so much as harbingers of doom or harbingers of unstoppable growth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, let's think about it this way. The United States has gone above and beyond what the Congressional Budget Office thought our GDP would be. Yeah. Not what the GDP would be this year. Not this year's projections that were made all the way back in 2017.
Wow.
We've beaten despite COVID.
Yeah.
We've beaten those projections.
That's insane.
That's insane. And why did that happen? Well, economists, as wrong as they are, this is what they're now dealing with. They are saying that the success in reviving the economy suggests that the Biden and Keynesian approach to future downturns is proven right. They want to see more downturns that rely on government power of the purse and less on Federal Reserve control of the cost of credit.
Yep.
So what this is saying, guys, is Washington's priority of full employment over dollar stabilization was the better move.
Yes.
That's what's happening here. The federal government's decision to inject money into the economy when it was doing poorly was directly responsible to our booming economic growth rather than the loosening of credit controls. Now, why is this? Well, when you loosen credit controls, and when I say that, I mean reducing interest rates. And why does reducing interest rates, in theory, boost the economy? Well, it becomes cheaper to borrow money. That means private investors can say, oh, I want to take more money out of the bank. I want to invest it here and there. And there's less risk to them in doing so because it costs less for them to borrow that money. But Washington injecting money into an economy has much less lag reflexes. And with the monetary policy of reducing interest rates, it takes time. It takes months. You have to build confidence. You have to all these private entities have to work decentralized, not communicate with each other, and pull that money out, and invest it. It's not as efficient.
Yeah.
And so this is the direct result of demand-driven economic recovery. This is stuff that came from the American Rescue Plan and other investments of the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Act, and the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. Now, those three, the CHIPS Act, the Infrastructure Bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act, those effects are barely seen yet. We don't even know the effects of those bills yet. These are decades-long bills.
Yes.
This is decades amounts of money. Because American Rescue Plan was right away money. Okay, that's what That's what we felt. These three other bills, we don't even know what that's going to do to our economy in the next 5 years.
We're only seeing the very, very beginnings of it with the private investment that those kinds of bills are enabling. But those bills are all based on creating infrastructure in one way or another, right? Manufacturing for chips. Infrastructure bill means roads, bridges, railroads,
Tunnels,
airports. Inflation Reduction Act is infrastructure for clean energy creation, right? EVs, EV manufacturing, charging stations. All of the rewards that we're going to reap from those kinds of policies are decades long time frames.
Yes. And so if we're reaching 3.1 growth without feeling the long-term effects of these, just imagine what we're going to have when these start really pulling their weight.
Exactly.
And so what I want to bring this out is this is a real return to Keynesian economic theory. And I believe the death of neoliberalism in America.
Really?
I think this is, well, at least it's the beginning of the end. It's a shift of dramatic proportions.
I agree. Well, I'm just skeptical that this Keynesianism will hold.
Yes.
I think it at least has introduced us to a period where Keynesianism is finally put back on the level of neoliberalism.
Yes.
And can compete with it from election cycle to election cycle.
One reason that I feel like it might hold is because Biden wasn't the first president to do it. It was Trump. Trump, with the CARES Act, under the with the Democrat House and the Republican Senate, they passed the CARES Act. This did the PPP loans, where you're loaning money to businesses. It did a stimulus check. It did expanded unemployment insurance. All of that was initially done under Donald Trump. So if there's a bipartisan consensus of anti-neoliberalism in times of economic downturn, there we go.
We're safe.
We're safe.
We're through.
We're through. So
okay.
This is an analysis from one Washington Post economic advisor. They said putting money in people's hands versus moving around interest rates, which is monetary policy, fiscal policy is going to be stronger. We cannot go into the next crisis being like, oh, the Fed's got this.
I love that you quoted Claudia Sam here, who's and one of the few economists that actually got it right that we weren't going to see recession in 2023.
And so there we go.
Yeah.
And now we it's nice knowing that Washington won't be bought into the mindset that, oh, the Fed's got this all taken care of. We've learned from that mistake. Yeah. That's the mistake that was made in 2008, guys. That was the mistake in 2008. Obama, when he passed his stimulus bill, it was about $800 billion for his American Rescue Plan back in 08, 09, around there, 09. Now, he had other economic advisors telling him, you got to go over $1 trillion. You got to go bigger. You have to go bigger. They're like, even if you do $1 trillion and you think that's too big for right now, you won't get another bill passed. And Obama was making the calculation like maybe 800 billion was the right number. And if it's not the right number, we can come back and do it again later. That was the mistake because Obama passes the stimulus bill. America has a sluggish recovery. He loses the midterm election in 2010. And with Republicans in the House, they are forcing him to do cutbacks in federal spending, which only prolonged the Great Recession. And that is what I want to kind of get to and how long it took for us to get back to our employment figures and job creation post-economic downturn. So in the 2008 recession, it took us 77 months to get us back to the amount of jobs we had prior to 2008.
6.5 years?
6.5 years to get back.
Wow.
In the 2001 recession, it took us around 50 months. In the 2020 recession, it took us 25. And that's because of a different approach to this economic downturn.
Yep.
Also, different countries around the world had different approaches, okay? So when we look to other peer countries, right? The United States is 7% larger than what it was before the pandemic. That is twice what Japan gained and way better than Germany's 0.3% growth that we've talked about on this show.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, over the 4 years through September, the most recent comparison available, U.S. wages after inflation grew by 2.8%. That's real wage growth, 2.8%. Let's look at internationally. Italian wages sank by 9%, and German workers earned 7.2% less than they had before the pandemic. That's showing that what America has done here has been incredibly beneficial. And then here's the difference of policy. The United States spent 25.5% of gross domestic product. Germany only devoted 15.3% of GDP to the pandemic, France 9.6%, Italy 10.9%, and Britain 19%. These countries didn't go big enough at the time when it mattered in order to bounce their economies back. There's other confounding variables like, prices of energy because of Russia's war in Ukraine. There were other things going on. But because they didn't go down this path, they made themselves that much more vulnerable to these other international shocks.
I do want to quickly point out, too, that this really emphasizes the point that inflation is so very much not just a function of government spending, of this kind of fiscal stimulus. Because the U.S. tamed inflation much faster than Germany, than France, than Britain, than all of these peer countries in Europe. Okay? So Germany, having spent only 15.3% of its GDP, Germany's still dealing with higher inflation than 5%. So everybody who's complaining or who might listen to what we're talking about right now and complain and say that spending 25.5%, sure, it might have helped the economy, might have helped employment, but look at what it did to inflation. No, it clearly is not the problem if these countries that spent so much less are still dealing with higher inflation than we are now.
Yes, there are economists suggest that maybe 2% of inflation at most was due to the American Rescue Plan. 2% at most was because of the Inflation Reduction Act. So then what was the downside to all this debt? I don't know. We'll have to see. Right now, our GDP ratio is 120%, right? So that means our debt is 120% of what our GDP is, around there.
Is that true? Okay.
Yeah, it's around 120, 115, 118, something like that.
Okay.
All right. Now, again, we'll see what the effects of this are, but America is actually currently in the process of dampening the amount of money in circulation. We're actually decreasing our money printing right now. So we're only going to see that debt decrease over the next couple of years, especially because the Inflation Reduction Act was a deficit neutral piece of legislation.
Okay.
So, yeah, I don't imagine the debt to go up anymore. This is now going to be a slide back down in terms of our debt.
Okay.
What are you seeing? What are you reading?
No? I didn't find anything else.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the big takeaway here is that congressional actions can affect the economy way faster than the lagged impacts of changings of borrowing costs.
Which just makes so much sense intuitively,
course.
right? Like the people who are going to be affected by interest rate changes are mostly major lenders, right? And those major lenders are it's going to go to institutions, and there's kind of, I think about it like frictional losses within the system, right?
Yep.
Before the money, it's why trickle-down economics doesn't work, because the money, it gets dispersed higher up in the distribution where it's going to be spent less effectively for the economy, and only a portion of it gets down to the bottom of the distribution, and it gets down there much, much slower.
Yeah.
So by putting money with stimulus checks directly into the hands of everybody in the economy, you just do so much more to fuel it.
Absolutely. And so there we are, guys. America is in the best position of any other peer nation.
We're killing it.
Killing it.
Absolutely killing it.